Hello, everybody. It's been nearly a month since the class of 2021 had its commencement, the second class to do so virtually because of the COVID-19 pandemic following the class of 2020. That all puts into perspective having our own college reunions on Zoom too. In the class of 1996's case, our 25th. You only get a 25th once. On the bright side, it's our last class reunion before we turn 50. Now, I can't seem to look at the camera and remember to speech at the same time, so please excuse me as I read off my computer screen on Zoom. I have notes here telling me to smile, sit up, and don't cough, so you'll have to be generous and give me some grace here. Our class book online now has upwards of 85 entries. It's wonderful to see many of your photos, to read what you are up to, your favorite Columbia memories, your favorite restaurants and bars near campus, and the classes you'd love to take again. Please add your own profile to the class book if you haven't already. And stay engaged with Columbia, whether supporting current students or alumni through the Odyssey Mentoring Program, joining our class Facebook page and posting updates there, or writing your class correspondent for Columbia College Today. In our case, I want to give a special shout out to our dedicated correspondent, Anna Sauper, who's been at this for 25 years. Think about that. Every time I get the magazine, I instantly flip to the back to read what any of you are up to. I found an archive entry from the spring 1999 issue, which is the furthest I could go back in CCT's online archives, when Anna was a law student at Northwestern. She wrote about Rafael Calazzo's efforts to build a news website for Latinos in the United States and abroad, Andy List teaching special education, and Britta Jacobson in her first year at Harvard Law School. Flash forward to tonight, we have a terrific panel. And before I get to that, I want to recognize the more than 30 classmates on the 1996 reunion committee involved with the fundraising, programming, outreach, as well as being speakers and moderators in the months leading to and including these two reunion weeks. One of them, Daria Ibn Tamas, my co-chair on the programming committee, will close out tonight's event. And also, I want to give many thanks to the tireless efforts of Ashley Bleem, Kayla DeStefano, Kyle Krause, and the team at Columbia College Alumni Relations who are juggling lots of class reunions, about 14 of them, and all the logistical and technical challenges that arise while welcoming alumni from around the world. Those celebrating reunions include the class of 1956, celebrating their 65th, to 2020, celebrating their first. And nearly all the reunions offerings are being recorded so that you can catch up on those you missed. Recordings should be available next week. Among them, a talk happening right now at the same time as this one with Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin and Columbia trustee Wanda Holland Green on Toni Morrison and the Core, the evolution of Black studies at Columbia, along with jazz and feminism. I would have hated to miss that one. In fact, I even have Professor Griffin's book, an autographed copy of Harlem Nocturne about Harlem during World War II and the years after through the eyes of three Black women artists, Pearl Primus, Ann Petrie, and Mary Lou Williams. So do check out the other talks. Now for our own, we have an all-class of 1996 panel who will help us look back at these past months, particularly in the dark days before we had a vaccine, and also forward. To participate in the Q&A portion of tonight's event, please pose your question at any time in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, along with your graduation year. We're very happy to welcome other classes tonight. Your question will be visible only to our facilitator, and we'll get to as many as we can. For optimal viewing, please enter full screen mode. Our moderator is Harriet Ryan, an investigative reporter for the Los Angeles Times, who with two other journalists wrote about a University of Southern California gynecologist accused of violating hundreds of women for nearly 30 years. Their stories led to the resignation of USC's president and the university's $215 million settlement in the case. It would be the LAPD's largest ever sex abuse investigation involving a single suspect. For their reporting, Harriet, along with her colleagues, Matt Hamilton and Paul Pringle, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for investigative reporting. Harriet, it is a real honor in having you moderate our very special panel tonight. Thank you. The stage is yours to introduce our classmates.
Thank you, Liz. I really appreciate your kind words. If you're like me, over the past 15 months, you haven't had many substantive conversations that weren't about COVID in some way or another. And at this point, I feel sometimes that we all sort of consider ourselves experts in the pandemic, and we're just rearing to offer opinions on vaccine hesitancy or herd immunity, what's going on with that lab in Wuhan, or if we're ever going back to work. We just can't wait to tell other people our opinions. But the truth is that we often don't know what we're talking about. So I am delighted tonight to welcome three classmates who know what they're talking about. And I think this is gonna be a great discussion. I'm really excited. The first up is Tom Boyke. Tom is the director of the Global Health Program and a senior fellow for Global Health, Economics, and Development at the Council of Foreign Relations. He's also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown and the author of a 2018 book, Plagues and the Paradox of Progress: Why the World is Getting Healthier in Worrisome Ways. Tom has testified before Congress on a range of public health issues, including just a few weeks ago, he was before the House Foreign Affairs Committee explaining the long-term global implications of the pandemic. And if you're a regular listener to NPR or a viewer of CNN, PBS, or the Today Show, you probably recognize Tom from his many appearances in the past year. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Dr. Ravi Amaravati. He's an associate professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's the co-leader of the Cancer Therapeutics Program at the Abramson Cancer Center. Ravi's an oncologist who directs a laboratory that investigates resistance mechanisms to cancer therapy, runs clinical trials, and treats patients with advanced melanoma and other treatment-resistant cancers. That's not why he's here tonight. He's here tonight because last March, a Penn alum who was occupying the White House at the time suggested that people take a specific drug, hydroxychloroquine for COVID. And Ravi had used that drug for a decade in his lab. And he ended up doing groundbreaking research at a breakneck pace that showed that maybe President Trump wasn't the medical expert that he thought he was. So he's going to tell us about that tonight. And last, but certainly not least, is our legal expert, Barbara Antonucci. She's an attorney in San Francisco, specializing in workplace law. She's a partner at Constangy, Brooks, Smith, and Profit. And that's a firm that specializes in workplace employment law, and their clientele includes Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and nonprofits. And Barbara herself has represented a diverse array of employers, from airlines and railroads to big box retailers, hotel chains, tech companies, and media networks. And over the last year, she's been the first call for many employers trying to navigate this pandemic world. And we are excited to hear what she has to say about that. So welcome, Barbara.
Thanks, Harriet. Hi, everybody.
So let's just get started with the lay of the land. Tom, where are we in the global pandemic as we sit here tonight?
Great. Well, thank you, first of all, Harriet, for that really kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with our class and with all of you. So thank you for this chance. I want to say two things just quickly before we start. One is that it's been obviously a devastating last 17 months. I have no doubt we have classmates or their families that have suffered in this pandemic. And I just want to say our thoughts, of course, are with you. And I look forward to the next occasion when we can all be together in person again. The second is that it is, of course, on the East Coast bedtime, and I have 3 small children who will almost certainly make an appearance either verbally or in person. So I will just apologize for that up front. So where we are in the pandemic, on the US side, the news is largely good. Cases are down tenfold from their peak in January, but they are still, we're still much higher. The caseload is still much higher than where we need to be to effectively control the spread. And for the millions that remain unvaccinated, the risks remain high. In states like Maine or Colorado or Michigan, actually for unvaccinated populations, the adjusted rate is really no different than it was in January. So for the unvaccinated, the world doesn't look as different as we would like to see. So a lot of good things to point to, but still some concerns. That's largely the situation globally, which is for the unvaccinated, this pandemic continues to rage. While we've made significant headway in the United States and in Europe, the pandemic continues to be surging in many other countries and regions. Obviously, we've all heard a lot about the tragedy unfolding in India and what's happening there. But for most of this pandemic, the US, Europe, and Latin America have represented 80% of the deaths from this pandemic. While in Europe and the US, we've now reached a point in many European countries and in the US that the majority of the population has received one dose. That is not true in South America. And with the decline that we're seeing now in Europe and North America and to some extent parts of Asia, that is not extending to South America, where we are seeing surging cases in Colombia and Uruguay and Argentina. And that's really a byproduct of inequitable access to vaccines. We've distributed 1.7 billion vaccines globally, but 3 out of 4 of those doses have been administered in just 9 countries. So we have a long way to go, unfortunately, on the global side. So that's really where we are at this point.
Thank you. Is it possible to estimate whether we're looking at a number of months, many years that COVID will be on this planet?
COVID is likely to be forever on this planet. At this point, it is so widespread. I think it's likely to be endemic. The issue is really more of a matter of whether we can contain the spread and protect the most vulnerable. That is true potentially in the United States, particularly why we expect at least as many as 30% of Americans to forego vaccination. And obviously children aren't vaccinated, so we will still see pockets of spread for some extended period of time in the US, but globally we are years away from reaching the level of vaccination. And it's much more likely that we're looking at this virus to be endemic, something that is with us.
Wow, okay. Ravi, let me ask you, Tom mentioned vaccines and getting to some kind of immunity. Is herd immunity a possibility still in America? Is it something that, where do we stand on that now?
Yeah, thank you, Harriet. And it's great to be here with my classmates on this wonderful occasion. But I echo what Tom's saying. We are far away, or we will never get to eradicating coronavirus. It'll be more like the flu if we're lucky. And the herd immunity question is interesting because I'm not an epidemiologist, and I think there's a technical definition of that which is being lost here. But if we just want to get to what, in colloquial terms, herd immunity, I think it's going to vary depending on where you are. What is your context? If you're in a bar, maybe you need to get a 95% herd immunity before you get herd immunity. But if you're in rural America and you really stay away from each other and you wear masks, maybe you only need 50% immunity to get herd immunity, i.e. the virus kind of just stops dead because there's nowhere else to spread, right? So I think that's gonna have to be why we have to change our focus from having like a a general statement for everybody in the same country to understanding the microcosms of how this virus is going to spread. And I think that we're in good shape. The US is in good shape right now, but it's a matter of, will the variants come that escape these vaccines or enough to cause more hospitalizations?
Okay, I mean, one group that we all know is not vaccinated and are glomming together every day, Monday through Friday, are children. What do we know about children and COVID and their ability to spread it and the danger that they pose to each other and the people around them?
Yeah, we have conflicting reports depending on when they were published, when the study was done, again, what context it was done in. I think what's happening now is that the virus is going to where it can go, and that is the unvaccinated, and that's the younger kids. And a recent study this week showed that young children who are not eligible for the vaccine have a tendency to carry the variants that we're concerned about there, that are more infective and can cause more problems. But the older literature, or like, a year ago or 6 months ago, showed that younger kids don't get as sick with COVID, except for that rare syndrome. It's rare, but it's about 15 to 20%. It's not that rare, right? It's just rare in the grand scheme of all the COVID infections, but it does happen if you have children. So I think it is important that we continue the clinical trials that will end up getting the approval for the vaccine in children, because by now the vaccine has been proven to be safe in adults and in teenagers, at least in the short term. And so I would feel very comfortable vaccinating my 7-year-old with one of the vaccines that are approved right now for older children.
For Tom and Ravi, do you have a sense of when that the approval to use the vaccine in children under the age of 12, do you have a sense of when that will be coming?
I've seen projections late fall is the last I've seen. Maybe Ravi knows more, and maybe that's been accelerated given what we've seen, but late fall is what they're expecting initially.
Yeah, I see the same thing, but I was surprised at how the teenage timeline was moved up a little bit. So I think the FDA panel is getting more comfortable with the data that's coming in from the real world, like Israel and like some of the data now in the US coming out.
Okay, Barbara, you're going to be our voice from the non-scientific sector. From a standpoint of commerce and businesses in the US, are things going back to normal? What's sort of the state of things right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will probably be a voice of positivity in response to that question because in the US, we are, for the most part, getting back to normal in the sense that many jurisdictions, of course, like the restrictions that we saw during COVID ranged from wearing masks to capacity restrictions to vaccinations to social distancing to screening and temperature checking, and all businesses, depending on industry, depending on location, county, depending on even employee, varied in terms of what those restrictions were. Now what we are seeing in many jurisdictions is an increasing lifting of at least the capacity restrictions, which are allowing businesses to come back. People are, different counties and states are going to, the least restrictive tier or phase. Of course, there is some variance across the country, but we're seeing businesses trying to get back to a new normal while maintaining safety protocols. The question is, how long is that going to last? And, my personal advice to businesses is we should be prepared to have protocols and plans in place for those tiers shifting if in fact there's a need in the future.
Something that gets discussed a lot is mandatory vaccines for employees and even the customers of certain businesses or vacation resorts or even countries, I guess. What do you tell people? Is it possible to tell your employees they need to get vaccinated? Is that even allowed? And what about customers?
That's a very difficult question for a lawyer to answer because we are so risk averse in how we provide advice to our clients. But we have seen some real positive pro-vaccination steps being taken, particularly by the federal and state discrimination agencies, such as like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They've come out with guidances to employers recommending or stating that vaccinations, can be mandated in the workplace as long as there's a reasonable business justification for doing so, and as long as there are certain exceptions provided for individuals who have disabilities or religious objections to those vaccinations. So certainly you're seeing a trend amongst the agencies in attempting to promote vaccinations and at least relieve some of the pressures on businesses that existed in terms of requiring employees to undergo medical testing. However, there are still some significant risks in doing so, for reasons that employees, can often say something as simple as getting a vaccination stresses me out or, gives me anxiety. And all of a sudden that could potentially become a medical issue subject to one of those exceptions. And so I would say to businesses, proceed with caution in terms of mandating vaccines in the workplace. Although my personal moral compass would like me to say otherwise.
I think, I know in California for this exception to vaccines for children got us in a lot of trouble in certain school districts where all the children were opting out. For the crunchier the school district, the more people were opting out, and there ended up being outbreaks of measles and other diseases because of that. So that it can be abused, but obviously there are some reasons why people legitimately don't want the vaccine. One
thing I will say, Harriet, that you pointed out is there's certainly certain types of businesses where, there are regulations and ordinances in place that require vaccination. So such as what you mentioned, like, certain school aspect industries like education and healthcare. And of course, those weren't the businesses I was referring to.
Okay. Tom, I know you've been outspoken about what's going on, sort of the disparity between the rest of the world and the distribution of vaccines in wealthier countries. And you've said that there's going to be a long-term cost to the decision that sort of is nationalistic in the distribution of vaccines. Can you explain a little bit more about that? What is the cost of letting the wealthier countries just vaccinate everybody before the poor countries really get going?
Great. So it's really threefold: health, economic, and then I would say the legacy around global cooperation. So let's start from the health side. With vaccination, the rate of global vaccinations being slow, you've seen surges of cases in the countries that have gone unvaccinated. It's not a surprise where we're seeing the most cases occurring, whether it's in Central Eastern Europe or in South America or in parts of South Asia. So that in some instances poses a risk, of course, to Americans in that both it creates reservoirs of this virus, but it also may be spurring the emergence of dangerous variants that we've heard so much about. Some of those variants we may get variants that are against which our vaccines are less effective. And if that were to occur, it may be that this undoes some of the progress we've had in the United States. So both in terms of the humanitarian loss of people dying unnecessarily with vaccines, we are at a point where we're vaccinating 12-year-olds before many countries have vaccinated their health workers. That poses risk to collapsing health systems, and again, the rise of these dangerous variants. Even for countries last year that were able to shift to the economic side, even for countries that were able to effectively control the spread of this virus, so New Zealand, South Korea, or Taiwan, suffered grievously economically, globally, because of what was happening in other nations. We are interconnected. And the IMF recently put out last week a report talking about the tens of trillions of dollars we would save by being able to bring this pandemic under control even 6 months earlier. So from an economic value proposition, that's pretty strong. Last thing I would point out is just around global cooperation. We are in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic where there is a medical intervention. It's in the interest of every nation to share. And if under these circumstances, we cannot find a way to share that, what are the prospects of working together on any other global collective action problem, whether it's climate change or nuclear non-proliferation? If at a moment like this, we couldn't figure out a way to work together on a shared challenge, what is the hope of addressing the many other challenges that we face?
If we were able to make you the king of the world tonight, what are the first couple of things you would do to address that globally?
So the US has more vaccines sitting in its refrigerator than have been distributed through the multilateral initiative around to serve the needs of low and middle income countries. We could start donating. We are producing 10 million more doses a week than we're using. We could start donating that now. We could have started donating that several months ago. So one thing we could immediately do is free up the supplies that we are sitting on. We're confident at this point that we are producing enough vaccines. We have been, particularly with mRNA vaccines, having some great success with manufacturing for some sustained period of time. We could do that. European nations could do that. Other nations could do that as well. So that's the first thing we should do. The second thing we should do is what has been clear in this pandemic is the same nations that are using the most vaccines are the ones that made them. There's 13 nations that represent over 90% of vaccine manufacturing. They're the same nations that are using the most vaccines. So it's not surprising for the rest of the world that has been sitting around 6 months into this pandemic. They'd like to make vaccines too, for the reasons they don't want to be waiting next time. We could start supporting that scale up. What we saw domestically around an Operation Warp Speed, whatever one might think of our former president, it did demonstrate the fact that policy intervention and financing is necessary in a crisis to scale up manufacturing. We could do the same thing globally. We did to some extent around HIV. There's no reason why we couldn't do it in this instance. So that is something that is going to take time and something we should start now, because it will take time, and that will help the need if we need boosters or second generation vaccines because of this concern around variants. So those are the two areas I would focus on.
Very interesting. I hope someone is listening. It's really moving to hear you talk about it, and it's something for all of us to think about. I want to give Ravi a chance to talk about his research. So a year and a half ago, you were a cancer researcher minding your own business. And then COVID came, and tell us how you got involved and what it was like to do research with essentially the world looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, I thought since this is a Columbia audience, I would start with a quote that kind of captures it all. And maybe it was in your Lit Hum course, maybe not. But it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, and it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light and the season of darkness, the spring of hope and the winter of despair. So if you remember back before the vaccines, everyone was scratching their heads, how can we beat this thing? And as Harriet mentioned, I am working on cancer, minding my own business, but I have been working on hydroxychloroquine for years because it has some interesting anti-cancer properties. And we've been running clinical trials with hydroxychloroquine. So unlike the COVID trials, the hydroxychloroquine trials in cancer look pretty promising. And in fact, this morning we got a large NCI grant to continue to work on this. So although I'm not an infectious disease expert, I am an expert on running these hydroxychloroquine trials for what it's worth. And I knew very well the side effects. So in the lab, hydroxychloroquine has come out on top of most FDA drugs in both preventing and treating viral infections in a dish. That includes the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. So back in February, I started developing this trial concept for hydroxychloroquine and really was getting nowhere in my institution. But by March of 2020, there was non-peer-reviewed data coming out of France that excited the world for the possibility of this very safe drug being used for COVID. There were hundreds of clinical trials launched around the world. And within 3 weeks of developing our first draft of our clinical trial, we had assembled a team of 50 investigators, secured $1 million worth of philanthropic funding, secured 100,000 pills of hydroxychloroquine from Novartis, and manufactured a matching placebo, got a contract with Quest to do our COVID testing, which was very difficult to find at that point, and got through all the regulatory hurdles that would normally take months to get through. And we were only able to do this because all of us decided to drop all of our other responsibilities and focus 24 hours a day on one mission. Our institution was all in on doing this trial. And so when the trial started, we were on a high. And then Trump touted hydroxychloroquine, and it was a gut punch. Bolsonaro, another gut punch. Fake news about hydroxychloroquine poisonings, and then an entirely fraudulent paper that passed through peer review and was published in the best journal, Lancet, proven to be completely fabricated data showing hydroxychloroquine to be a toxic drug, was a serious gut punch to me because I live and die by peer review. So by June, I was feeling like a punching bag. And meanwhile, I had a research team, mostly of young people trying to get into medical school and such, putting their lives at risk running the study during the pandemic. We had nurses who were willing to take the risk of joining our study and being randomized to a drug or a placebo. And this was really the first randomized drug trial in the history of University of Pennsylvania, which was the first hospital in the country. So in the end, we published our interim results that met the predetermined endpoint of futility, meaning no matter how many more participants we would have enrolled, we would have had the same outcome. We published in JAMA Internal Medicine just 6 months after we started this process, which is unheard of, at least in my experience. And since we published our paper, it's been viewed more than 220,000 times, which is far more than any other of my cancer papers. What we found was hydroxychloroquine was safe with no cardiac effects, but had no effect on the rates of COVID infections in nurses and doctors who were in contact with COVID patients every day. So in summary, we think we made an important contribution because a lot of these trials that were ongoing at the time ended up closing, and then their efforts were pushed to other more effective treatments like monoclonal antibodies and then the vaccines. So I think the Dickens quote is very accurate. It was the best of times and the worst of times. If I had to do it again, I would do it again. So I'll leave it at that.
You said that you actually joined Twitter to find out what people are saying about your research.
Yeah, I'd avoided Twitter for a while, and then I joined it, and now I'm avoiding it again.
What is it like to have this long and esteemed career in cancer research, and then sort of your greatest fame is for proving that something doesn't work?
Yeah. Sorry, I think you froze for a second.
Did you hear the question? Oh, I think we're losing Robbie.
Sorry about that. There's a glitchy connection here. Yeah, it was a tough pill to swallow, but so to speak. But I think there was a lot of learning there. There was I think I'm doing clinical trials better now, having run this trial, and I think it's going to carry forward into cancer. I also learned that if you do a little bit less, we're all used to multitasking, but if you multitask a little less, you get better results.
I want to ask all three of you to answer a question. If you had to, get in a time machine and go a year into the future, what are the lives of Americans going to be like? And to the extent, if Tom, if you want to talk about people in other countries, we've heard since the beginning of the pandemic, this is going to change everything. Our whole lives will be different. Forget about commuting. We're never going back to the office. Or people are going to be wearing masks always. And I'm just curious, each of you, I'll start with you, Barbara. How do you think our lives will be in a year?
Well, I can't see into the future, but I think one thing that's undeniable right now is that there has been a proven efficiency in and just betterment of life to a certain extent in certain areas, from the availability and accessibility of remote work in certain professions. And so just from the employer standpoint, I think that the world is going to continue to change how we think about work, how we think about, getting in that car and spending, 2 hours driving, or getting on that bus and that subway and spending time commuting, when we are now so accustomed to being able to use that time to work out or see our children or otherwise. I mean, I know that this pandemic has been really hard from the perspective of people losing jobs, and also people having to toggle a lot of responsibilities at home, including educating their own children. So I don't mean to minimize that in any way, but I do think that the one positive that's come out of it is that, to the extent that employees are feeling, we're before being told you can't work efficiently from home. It's a new day, and I think that's just going to continue into the future, and we're just going to be seeing more and more electronic ways to communicate and interact with each other, like telehealth and all the things that we're using now that we weren't using as much, 12 months ago.
Is it your sense that employers are going that have jobs that can be done remotely are going to be okay with people continuing to work remotely?
I think it's really dependent on, the industry and the culture of a business. I know that companies are dealing with that in a variety of different ways. And, being out here in San Francisco near Silicon Valley, there's a lot of pressure to allow employees the choice to continue to work remotely when possible.
Okay. Robbie, you want to take a stab at it? Our life in a year?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just cover one segment, which is the medical part. I think a lot of people have put off important screenings, cancers that they can see are growing, but they're worried about going in, heart disease, they've gained weight, they're sedentary. So we're going to probably see a new pandemic of health problems. There's the long COVID syndrome, there's mental health problems. Kids that are fine right now may struggle next year when much more is expected of them. And so I think we're going to have the healthcare system is going to be overloaded regardless of whether or not it's from COVID. And I think we have to figure out ways to anticipate those problems and again, bolster those segments of the healthcare system.
Interesting. Tom?
Great. So 2018, I wrote this book that you were kind enough to mention in the introduction, which is really actually about the history of humankind's struggles with infectious disease and how they've shaped society and human history, which my wife found to be a horribly morbid topic, but it's not. Because ultimately, it's really about, in the age prior to effective treatments, how societies would reinvent themselves to overcome these threats. Because ultimately, plagues put a mirror to the people they afflict. They show the collective risks that emerge when we don't take care of our most vulnerable. And that sense of risk changed how elites thought of societies, spurred the creation of the modern state, affected the evolution of cities, drove, and to some degree, the geography of economic development globally. So I say all this because what I worry is that life won't change very much, that the lessons people will draw from this pandemic are fundamentally that we need to develop vaccines faster. And all the things we've learned in this pandemic around how we treat our elderly, the inequities of the healthcare system, the need for trust and clear communication from our leaders. All of that will be largely forgotten in favor of faster treatments and better run clinical trials. And if that's the case, those are good things. But if that's the case, it will be a tremendous shame and will be no safer really ultimately from the next threat like this that emerges.
What is the lesson that you believe that we should take from the pandemic?
So to me, for somebody who works in global health, people are always surprised, in this paper or this book, people predicted the next pandemic. Pretty much everybody predicted the next pandemic. This is not a surprise to people that work in global health that we should have a pandemic or that it should emerge with a respiratory disease or even necessarily coronavirus coming from Asia. What is a surprise is despite all the investments, the preparations, the high capacity of some nations, how poorly we did in confronting it. And to me, that is, you can't explain that away really with just demographic factors. You can't explain it away from wealth. It's really largely about trust and communication with governments and how our health systems treat the most vulnerable. And to me, those are really ultimately the lessons moving forward. But again, I worry that we're not taking them on board. That when you think about what we're focusing on globally to address the next pandemic, it's really around how can we develop vaccines faster.
Okay, thank you. I want to take that was well said. I want to take a few questions from our people in the audience. The first one's about the Olympics. With the controversy in Japan proceeding with the Olympics, it's surprising how low the Japanese vaccination rate is. How did Japan fall so far behind with so much at stake? And I just want to add to that there have been issues with the Olympics from a legal point of view about who's indemnifying the athletes. A lot of citizens in Japan actually don't want the Olympics, which are, I believe, scheduled to start at the end of July there. Let me ask, start with you, Ravi. First of all, if you know, you can speak about the Japanese experience, but if you were in charge of the Olympics, would you go forward at the end of July?
I think it's a tough call. I think that, you know, Japan's an island. They were able to, you know, curtail entry of the virus into the island. But once it enters, it's worse to be on the island, right? So that's the problem they're facing. But the Olympics is a rich guy thing, right? So they have a lot of money. If they can create an NBA bubble, I don't know how they're planning to do it, but it's not that, you know, I think they can pull it off. And I think it's just a matter of keeping away the locals and making it a virtual event for the spectators. So the athletes will not have that same mix that they're, you know, famous for having in the Olympic Village. But if they are planning on doing that, then it's going to be a disaster.
Tom,
a historic disaster.
Can you speak to Japanese experience up to date, and then comment on the prospect of the Olympics going off?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say about Japan is a fascinating case study in this pandemic. They didn't do a lot of testing. They didn't do a lot of contact tracing overall in the way that people, not the rates that people would have seen elsewhere. You know, they were just really innovative how they went about it, and had some good ideas about sort of ring fencing cases and being able to head off clusters of cases. They had a good idea of how this was spreading. I say all this because, and they also have a tradition of mask wearing. So they really, this was not a hard sell for their population in the way that it was in the United States. And those things have really combined. I actually agree with Ravi that I'm sure the athletes want to compete. For many of them, they may miss their window otherwise. They've been training their whole lives for this, and I have some sympathy for that. I have no doubt that he's also right that there is a version of this Olympics that could be held safely. I don't know if that's the version ultimately we are going to get in Japan. And I know that there's a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine that was published, I think today or yesterday, arguing that there's not much indication that is the version of the Olympics we're going to get. So I think that is the concern ultimately, that safe version that Ravi outlined that you could potentially have with infinite resources and infinite time is not ultimately what we're likely to receive in Japan.
I think one of the issues raised in that New England Journal piece was about insurance for athletes and the kind of the legal aspects of that. Barbara, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to say about that, I would love to hear it.
The fact that they'll indemnify and insure athletes,
or that they won't, that it's on the individual.
Yeah, that they won't. Yeah, I mean, there are some concerns with respect to, you know, and I'm not familiar with international laws on this, so I can't really speak to, you know, what would apply were the person working in Japan, or whether even American law applies to the athletes that are going over there because they're being, you know, sent by the United States in some, you know, diplomatic capacity. I don't know what laws would even apply to the context at issue. So it's hard for me to speak to that.
Fair enough. We have a bunch more questions. So whoever wants to take this one, what do you think of the wisdom of the CDC's decision to cease investigating quote unquote mild breakthrough infections? What are the risks of this decision? Does anyone feel comfortable answering that?
That's a tough one. I think it's difficult to investigate them beyond just categorizing them, counting them, because they're just going to happen without, like, how do you know that it didn't happen? You know, you didn't get tested, you got it, you sneezed, you coughed, you didn't get tested. You said, I'm already vaccinated. Why do I need to go get tested? You move around, you're fine. And yes, there is a chance that you may have spread it, right? But the actual number of symptomatic infections that get counted are so low compared to, in real life, compared to the clinical trials even, that, and one of the key factors is the hospitalization rates are going down. So ultimately, we're trying to prevent hospitals from being flooded, overflowed, patients lining up and dying, not because we couldn't treat them, but I mean, they couldn't get to treatment. So that's already happening. And I think that's the reason why they're focusing on symptomatic cases, not trying to chase down asymptomatic cases and waste resources. But Tom may have a different perspective on this.
I was actually going to take on the mask question on there. I thought that was a good answer from that perspective. On the mask question, I did have concern with the way CDC announced it.
Oh, do you want to just say what the question was?
Oh, I'm sorry. The same question on the chat. I didn't realize you didn't read both.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so
your fault.
No, let me read it.
Cheating by reading ahead.
It says, what do you think of the CDC's new mask guidance, given the difficulty in identifying who has and has not been vaccinated? Tom.
Great question. So I had real concern about the CDC guidance, at least the way it was communicated. There are a number of southern states, for instance, where we are at just over a third of adults receiving one dose. Vermont, we're at 80%. So huge differences. And I would have rather seen them use that as a bit more of a carrot and worked with individual states to say, once we reach a certain level of vaccination, here's what we can do, as opposed to making the announcement now. And I think the horse is a bit out of the barn, and you're seeing mask rates drop significantly everywhere, not just in the states that have high rates of vaccination. So I think that was miscommunicated. That may have been their intention, but I don't think that's what came across, particularly around the early publicity around it.
Okay. Ravi, I see someone wanted to know the recent study that you mentioned earlier tonight regarding younger kids. You said there was a new research paper this week. Can you share where you read that or anything about it so this person can track it down?
I can follow up. I forget which journal it was in, but basically it showed that the coronavirus in kids that's being detected is almost all more contagious variants. So that's basically it. It wasn't, there wasn't much more of that, but there are so few reports on kids that this is, and it's very timely now that this is the group that's not vaccinated or doesn't have access to the vaccine.
Okay, I suspect this question will be for you as well, but maybe Tom. What do you think the future utility of monoclonal antibody treatment will be? And will an injection of it be more readily available?
Yeah, it's a great question. So these are surprisingly effective treatments compared to, remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine, these other drugs that really showed no benefit or even just very mild benefit. These monoclonal antibodies, if given at an earlier time point in the infection, can help clear the infection and prevent that secondary reaction that your body gets when you have a high level of virus going on, and that prevents the hospitalization, the shortness of breath, and so forth. The problem with them is that they're intravenous, so you need an IV placed. Remember, the patient has coronavirus, so you can't just go into their house and place an IV. So it becomes very tricky how to get patients to a monoclonal antibody a monoclonal antibody clinic. And it's really, you have to set up a specialized clinic that can handle the flow of infected patients away from the other vulnerable populations in the hospital and get them consented. There are side effects, they need to know about it, treated, and then sent home. So it took us a little while at Penn to get it up and running, but it is, it's there. And then there's other challenges as far as staffing it, because it's only for one thing that's never existed before. So there are no doctors for that clinic. They have to be taken away from the other things that we're doing. And by the way, the other things are coming back. So that's going to be an issue of the medical force and workforce and how they're deployed in to use these various things.
Okay. The next question is like more appropriate for Meet the Press, so I'm going to make you guys all answer it. The question is, we have midterm elections coming up in 2022 and another presidential election in 2024. How fragile is the current pace of progress against the pandemic in the US? How dependent is progress on the political climate in Washington? Barbara?
Why me first? I have to, I mean, I think that, you know, this is a very political question. And frankly, I think to say that politics has nothing to do with it would just be false. I mean, we've seen throughout the course of how, you know, how certain communications were made to the public, to the American public throughout the pandemic, you know, changed and directed behavior. And I think that it is important who we have in leadership, and it is important just for that reason alone, beyond just all the legislative and regulatory, you know, and other decisions that, you know, and executive decisions that are being made. Just the communication piece and how that drives behavior, I think we've seen exactly what's happened in the past, and I think it will be important in the future.
When you were writing your book and that came out in 2018, did you foresee that a pandemic would be so politicized? Is that something that surprised you, or that's something that's sort of been a trend in past outbreaks?
So it did surprise me to the extent that it occurred. I mean, you've definitely seen pockets of it in past outbreaks, and you can look at their great books on the 1918 flu and what happened in different states, and you've definitely seen pockets of this sort of thing before. That said, you know, around this issue of communication, I mean, we have guidelines upon guidelines of what to do in a health crisis, on how your communicators, our most effective communicators in the past have been the CDC, and how political officials should defer to health officials in a crisis, and the virtuous feedback loop you get from building trust in the messages by being first and being correct, being honest, and being willing to update your guidance as you move along. And all of that was thrown out the window, not just in our country, but in others as well, and in this pandemic. And again, the degree to which we ignored what we had developed, it did surprise me. On what we can see on the election, I think a lot of it depends on where you think we're going to be in the pandemic in next year. in the United States. There is a decent chance with the level of vaccination, if we are able to continue to drive it, and depending on what we see on variants, that we may have some protection. I think we'll have other crises, and political leadership will matter for that. And I think how we engage with the world on these problems, political leadership will certainly matter for that. You know, I do think there's a chance that some of what we're doing domestically will be durable. And I hope that's the case.
Okay, and Barbara, there's a question for you. It said, you mentioned that in Silicon Valley, there is pressure to allow individuals the flexibility to manage how they work, remotely, hybrid, et cetera. For organizations that are mandating that employees get vaccinated, do you foresee any disciplinary action being made for those that choose not to receive the vaccine, or for those that aren't mandating, but indicating that the staff that want to return to the office must be vaccinated? Additional hesitancy from individuals to not get vaccinated because they prefer to work from home. Wow. What do you think?
Yeah, I get that question every day from clients. What do we do if we have an individual who is refusing to be vaccinated and refusing to come back to work, particularly in jobs that require the individual to be at work? And I think it just remains to be seen sort of how companies will. What I anticipate happening and what I'm advising clients is that you need to really look at the individual circumstances. And as I mentioned earlier, to apply a blanket rule across the board without understanding of what that individual's circumstances are, the reasons for their objections to being vaccinated and coming to work would be problematic. So we're just going to have to look on a case-by-case basis, take into account medical situations, take into account religious objections, and also take into account the needs of the business and how well the job can be performed from home.
Okay. Here we have somebody from Toronto saying, I'm watching from Toronto, where we are now providing the Pfizer vaccine to 12 and up in Ontario. I have a couple of questions. One, could you comment on our shared longest undefended border and when and how it should open up? I should add that Canada, currently 45% of our population has had one jab, but only 4% are fully vaccinated. And second question, we're just beginning to discuss vaccine hesitancy in teens here in Ontario. Although not prevalent, it is an issue. And I'm curious to know how the vaccine rollout is going in the States and how we can encourage children, teens in our lives to feel confident in taking the vaccine. So I guess the first question is about the longest undefended border and how long it should remain closed given sort of the disparity in our vaccination rates.
Tom, you want to take that?
Sure, I will try. So they're not that disparate. I mean, the U.S. just passed 50%, and it sounds like at least for the province of Ontario, they're at 45%. That's not an immaterial difference, but we're not talking about a sea change difference. I think honestly, it depends on what we're going to set up at the border. There's lots of conversations around vaccine certification, effectively vaccine passports, what a testing regime might look like, particularly if we can get better and cheaper point of care diagnostics. I'm in favor of moving towards that reality, but having state supported resources to start to enable that to occur. I think the U.S. President Biden, of course, has said that we expect to have vaccinated 70% of Americans by 4th of July. It sounds like Canada is not too far behind. And as we move towards those, I imagine we'll be in a position for those conversations about opening up the border to take a bit more life. We are slower in the US around opening up than certainly parts of Europe and some other regions of the world have been. I suspect with this administration, we're likely to continue to be cautious, but as we move to those upper levels of vaccination,
The second part of the question was about vaccine hesitancy, and it kind of goes with another question that was asked. Have we learned anything about health education and communication efforts to know how to be more effective in our messaging to a skeptical and manipulated population? How to improve public health education in general and to avoid the resistance to recommended preventative behaviors? And doesn't specify vaccinations, but vaccine hesitancy and this skeptical and manipulated population is definitely something that we're dealing with today. Ravi or Tom or Barbara, who wants to take that?
I can take that on. I mean, I see patients that are not getting the vaccine. They have cancer, they have all the Western diseases, and they're 65. They're African American. A lot of the patients that we see in Philadelphia that are not vaccinated. But there's also a pocket of white people in Lancaster County that won't do it. So it's not just African Americans or underserved minorities. And it's hard. We have, I have a pitch for every patient I see, and they often come to the appointment with a response of why they're not getting vaccinated. Sometimes it doesn't make sense at all, but it's very confident, their response. I have sleep apnea, so I use a CPAP. I don't want to deal with the side effects. I was advised by my doctor not to get it. So that's an interesting one, because I don't know which doctor would advise that, but it sounds really solid, right? And if they tell their friends that, then that's going to pass too. Or I saw a YouTube video showing that it was, so then there's this disinformation part that's out there of, this vaccine is going to lead to lots of medical problems that these dumb people that are getting vaccinated don't even know about yet. So then it becomes this twist where you're not getting the vaccine because you're actually more medically savvy than the people that are getting the vaccine. So I think it's a complex, thing here. It's nothing new. We've done this for flu vaccine for a long time. And it's just a matter of, this is a much more contagious virus. This is going to cause damage to a lot more people if we don't get this under control.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I can confirm what you say about hesitancy there. We have time for one last question. It looks like it's this one. Tom, you mentioned the number of vaccines that remain in the US stock, but not yet distributed, is quite large. And I see in the news story every day the number of vaccines that have been shipped outweighing those distributed. For the vaccines that need to be refrigerated and or have a limited shelf life, why is there not more of an initiative made to get these vaccines to countries you mentioned are in need? Are these non-distributed vaccines just going to waste?
They might, although I think, there have been a lot of reports about Canada sitting on some stores of AstraZeneca that might expire in a month. I am told by my Canadian colleagues that there is actually a plan to distribute those prior to that expiration date. We'll see if it happens. I honestly think the main reason they're not being distributed, well, actually two, I would say. The first is frankly political. There's a lack of political leadership, not just here, but in Europe as well, that people don't want to be sharing doses abroad while we haven't finished the mission at home. That's even if we have sufficient vaccine supplies to finish that mission. They do not want to be perceived and hear about it on certain news channels, how vaccines are going abroad while there are still Americans who have yet to receive them. Again, even though we have enough supply and we're producing enough per week. The second reason is more on concern around the variants and whether or not we need boosters. So that is hindering to some degree the sharing of supplies internationally. The only thing I would say there is even with boosters, the projections are we will have far more vaccines than we could possibly use. So I understand why that may mean we can share a little bit less than we might otherwise. It's a little hard to it's a little harder to justify that we're not starting to share now. It's really, frankly, I think mostly a political concern.
Well, that's depressing once again from you, Tom, but thank you. They actually, they said they-
I'm here apparently.
No, there's one more question. Could you speak to how large the number of people suffering from long COVID syndrome is, and how it may influence future research on chronic diseases broadly? Ravi, is that for you?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer. I don't know how you could record it well, because the symptoms of long COVID overlap with other common diseases. It overlaps with the problems that people had before COVID, like asthma. And so it becomes hard to tease apart what is the illness that's in that patient for other reasons versus for COVID. There are people that have pulmonary fibrosis after having COVID pneumonia. That's a straightforward. That's something that you can then follow in a clinic and then do research on those patients. There are patients that are having blood clots after COVID. They have no other reason to have blood clots. You can follow those. So I think you're going to start to see a whole nother medical specialty, if you will, of following these particular specific non-COVID long-term symptoms.
Interesting. Before I turn it over to Daria, Tom, if there are people that share your concerns about the morality of the way the vaccine distribution is playing out, what should we do?
So I do think we need to put pressure on political officials, your representatives. I think people the administration needs to be hearing from Congress that there is a different option than the one we're currently facing. They're starting to. I mean, the hearing I was part of, frankly, was about that mostly, which is, there are other countries in the world that are giving doses while we are not. China, India for a while, and others. So that type of political pressure works. And we're certainly, again, at a point, if we're going to be vaccinating children, which relatively speaking are low risk, that we need to be starting engaging certainly in these global.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. You're fantastic. I'm going to turn the panel over to Daria. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Daria Ibn Tomas, Program and Co-Chair of the 25th Reunion Committee. And that concludes this evening's alumni panel, COVID-19, a look back and a path forward. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Harriet Ryan and our three panelists for sharing their unique perspectives and insights with us today. It was a privilege to hear from each one of you. As you log off, I encourage you to take tonight's conversations with you as a reminder to stay inspired, to keep learning, to push the boundaries, and to always remain fiercely committed to the common good. After all, that is what it means to be a lion. We hope to see you at more of our Reunion 2021 programs this week and next. Enjoy your night.